Hi everyone, thanks for checking out this video or podcast episode, depending. And today I'd like to talk to you guys about one of my favorite topics, which is happiness. And more specifically, I want to talk about why we as humans are so bad at predicting what will make us happy. And if you don't believe me that we're bad at predicting what will make us happy, hopefully by the end of this episode, if you stick around with me, you'll be convinced. So I want to start off this discussion in a place that is maybe a little bit unexpected, but trust me, I'll link this to happiness. And I want to start off by talking about memory. And specifically, I want to talk about false memory. So I want to start with a study that if you've read up on this topic, you might have heard of this one. It's pretty well known. It was by Elizabeth Loftus. And essentially what happened in the study is there were participants who came into the research lab. They watched this video where two cars came together in a crash, and then later they came back and they answered some questions about what they saw. And the question that they were asked was, when the two cars came together, did you see any glass break? Now, the question was phrased in one of two ways. So some participants saw one version, the other participants saw another version. So one group of participants, they saw the question saying, did you see glass when the two cars just came together? Or it was kind of neutral language. And then the other set of participants, their question said, did you see glass when the cars crashed into each other? So maybe you see where I'm going with this, but the group that got the second question stem, which was crashed into each other, they were more likely to say that they saw glass. And in fact, there was no glass. And so the implication of this is that the way a question is phrased will impact how we remember it. And they've done other studies. There's one involving a stoplight sign, and I won't get into it, but they've kind of replicated that. So that's kind of like a soft memory thing. Like if somebody asks us a question, depending on how it's asked, we might misremember. Now, if you don't completely trust me when I say that we can come up with false memories, let me give another study, and this one is a bit more dramatic, I would say. So I really like this study, by the way. It's a good one. So there were some people who came into the psychology, it's always a psychology research study, and they were asked to journal about 5 events from their childhood, and they were given a list of 5 things. And 4 of the things were true. They were things that happened, like, I don't know, maybe that time you went to summer camp or went camping or something, whatever. But one of them was something that definitely didn't happen. And they made sure that it was something that didn't happen by checking with the participants' friends and family without telling the participant. So one of the common things that would be on the list was, I got lost in the mall. Or another one was, I went on a trip on a hot air balloon. So these participants were asked to write about these events. And 4 of the events happened, and one of them didn't happen. And so you would think that people would write about the events that happened, and when it came to the lost in the mall, they'd be like, well, that didn't happen, so they just wouldn't write anything. But no, they did. And then when they told the participants after, I mean, not all of them, but a good amount of them wrote about an event that did not happen, they said, no, this actually didn't happen. The participants, some of them were shocked because they had these vivid memories, and they just created these memories, right? And so that's pretty crazy. And the takeaway from this really is that we have this conception of memory. We think it's like a tape recorder, but it's really not. Our memory is reconstructed each time we remember events. We can create false memories. There was another similar really dramatic thing called the satanic panic, where kids were able to get these memories of satanic abuse that never happened because of the way they were questioned by psychologists. So our memory is fallible. So that's the point I want to get across with those discussions. And don't worry, we're going to link this to happiness. So the next thing, given that our memories are fallible, I want to highlight some specific parts of our memory about things that are important that we misremember and how that contributes to us being bad at predicting what will make us happy. So one thing I want to talk about is the fact that when we remember our past, we don't remember every single thing that happened. So that's pretty obvious, right? Do you remember exactly what you did last Tuesday at 10 a.m.? Probably not. But do you remember where you were? I mean, it depends how old you are, but when 9/11 happened, most people do remember that. They've done studies, and the 9/11 is called a flashbulb memory, which is essentially something that's so dramatic and so emotional that it gets really encoded in our nervous system and is something we're going to remember. And intuitively, you probably have the thought that, okay, I remember the important things in my life. Like I might remember my graduation, or, my wedding if I'm married, or the first time I met my spouse, or, important things. But what we don't really remember is that lunch that we had 3 weeks ago when we wanted to get the tuna sandwich and it wasn't there, so we took the ham. We don't remember those little things, right? And so that seems pretty reasonable. But the problem with us only remembering the past, I want to call it the big events, is that when we predict what will make us happy in the future, we think back to what made us happy in the past. And we're going to think back to the things that we remember. And we remember these big events. And so the problem is we're going to base our prediction of what will make us happy based on what we think these big events in the future are going to be. But the reality is that life is not made up of big events. There's very few big events. Life is made up of the mundane. Life is made up of the small moments. It's made up of, walking to the grocery store, brushing your teeth, snoozing for 10 minutes. Yet when we envision the future, we aren't thinking about those small details. And that's a problem. And that's what really makes people, one of the main things that makes people fail to predict what will make them happy. And let me give a study to kind of back this up. So they had a study where they talked to students at University of Virginia. And full disclosure, I'm Canadian. I also don't really follow sports. So anyways, they talked to these students, and they were football fans. I think football is a really big thing there. Anyways, they asked them, there was an upcoming game against University of Carolina, I believe, and they said, can you predict how happy you will be if your team wins versus if your team loses? So they made their little predictions, and then they followed up with them and saw how actually happy they were given the result, which I forget the result. That's how much I cared about football. Anyways, what they found was that the students really, they were off the mark, and they thought that their emotions would be more extreme than they actually were, because when they predicted the future, they're thinking about that big moment when the team loses or wins, and that elation or that disappointment. But the fact is, no matter what happens, 40 minutes later, they're going to be studying or having some coffee or something. And so they didn't think about those things. So they really thought it would be a way bigger deal than it was. And that really highlights part of this problem with us trying to think about what will make us happy. And another good example that I want to give you is, it comes specifically to the question of children. Now, I should do another episode on this, because this is such a tricky question. Do kids make people happy? There's so much mixed research. But I want to talk about one study that was done looking at Texas mothers. And what they did, there's this one way that psychology researchers track people's happiness, which is quite interesting. I mean, there's so many different ways to track happiness. Another cool subject for another time. But essentially, people wear these little monitors, and then they beep, and then people record how happy they are at that moment and what they're doing. So that way you get a real-time recollection of how happy people are in the moment, right? As opposed to remembering things. Because if you remember the past, you'd have that bias we were talking about towards favoring the big events, right? So people in general say that their kids make them happy. I mean, if you talk to any parent, that's probably what you're going to hear. And when they think, if you ask them, okay, what makes you happy about your kid? They're probably going to say, oh, the first time he smiled or walked, or, if they're older, graduated. They're probably not going to say, oh, that time that I fed them, some corn and spinach and they spit it in my face. Or that time we were at the park and they fell down. They're going to talk about the big events. And so people probably, they think that being a parent makes them happier than it actually does. And this study kind of shows that, because this study showed that it was mothers who were in Texas. They were basically not very happy looking after their kids. And they're not bad moms, just this is normal. But during the day-to-day activities of looking after their kids, they barely preferred it to commuting. And they preferred things they preferred eating food and watching TV. And so, I mean, that doesn't mean they don't love their kids, but it just means that the day-to-day life of parenting is filled with those mundane things that people don't really think about. And so if you're thinking, do I want to be a parent? It's difficult to predict that, because you're not going to think about those small little things. You're going to think about the big things, and the big things just don't occupy the majority of our lives, right? And there's one more thing I kind of want to talk about why we are bad at remembering the past, and how that impacts us predicting the future. So the study I kind of talked about, the one where the little thing went off and it beeped. It tracks how people feel in the moment, right? And so you would think if people like looked back at that, they would remember how happy they were in that moment or not. But the thing is, people don't. So this kind of goes back to memory. Let me explain this. I don't know if I made that super clear. So there was a study that was done, and there was a group of participants, and they did one of two different things. So in one condition, they stuck their hand in a bucket of ice cold water, like super cold to the point where it was painful. And they did this for, I'm pretty sure it was a minute and a half, and that was it, okay? Minute and a half, really cold water. The second condition, they stuck their hand again into super cold water for a minute and a half, and then they put their hand in a less cold bucket of water, but one that was still cold enough to be painful. And during, while they had their hands in the water, the researchers, asked them how much pain are you in, whatever. And they found that the participants were in pain throughout the whole thing. They were more in pain when the water was colder, but even when the water was milder, they were also still in pain, right? And then they asked the participants which condition, which of the two was less painful, looking back, even though they'd rated it during, and which one would you, if you had to do one of them, which one would you do again? So it should be a no-brainer, because the second one is just the first one plus an extra 30 seconds of discomfort. It's just additional badness, unpleasantness, right? So you should obviously want the shorter one, but I think it was about 70% of participants preferred the longer one. And why? And they actually, it's not just that they remembered it as being, more pleasant. They actually said they would prefer doing that one again, it's crazy. And the reason that is we have a bias called the recency bias, and there's also the starting, I think I'm butchering the names, but there's a bias where we remember the start of things and the end of things. And so people are remembering the end of the experiment, and it ended on a good note, and well, not a good note, but a less bad note than the other one, which ended in very cold water, so a very bad note. And if you think about what we talked about memory, this does make sense, because we can't remember everything, and so our brains are going to pick out certain things, and we talked about how they're going to pick out big events, but they'll also remember the beginning and the end, because those are natural points to remember. And beginnings and ends are also stories, and humans, we are storytellers. We are constantly rehearsing stories in our minds about our lives. People see patterns where they don't exist. We love stories, we love explanations. And so the end really impacted how people looked back, and that changed how they remembered it. And so that actually raises an interesting philosophical question, because should people prefer the first, which of the two ice conditions should people prefer? Because during them, they preferred the shorter one, because same amount of pain, but then they didn't have the extra added on pain. But then after the fact, they preferred the second one. So which one is really better, actually? Because a lot of our happiness, there's different kinds of happiness. Some of it is what we feel in the moment, but some of it is when we sit back and we reflect on our lives. That's another kind of way that people, researchers will measure happiness. They'll say, how satisfied are you with your life? So that's actually just an intriguing question. And I want to actually just give you one more study about this, because I personally find it quite fascinating. So researchers were looking at colonoscopies, and I don't know really too much about this, but it's painful, and apparently there is some way to make it less painful for part of it. So similar to the ice bucket challenge, they did a similar thing where people were either given the full colonoscopy and it ended on a bad note, or they gave them the full colonoscopy, but they ended it on a less bad note. So they did this. I think they inserted, I don't know the details exactly, the medical details, but it was less painful for the end. And you would have thought, again, that they would prefer the one that was shorter, but people preferred the one that ended on a better note. And this is something that's being considered as a medical intervention. So it's being taken, very seriously. And that's just another thing to back that up. And so I just kind of want to circle back, I think, to the beginning about why we're bad at predicting happiness. So let me give a little bit of evidence for this. I think the study I talked about the football players, what was funny was people were bad at predicting whether or not they would be how happy they would be after the game. But they also asked people to predict, people who weren't involved with the game, how happy they thought other people would be. And people were better at predicting how other people would feel than those people themselves. And this result has been replicated in different settings. I believe there was some study where people had to predict how happy somebody would be if they like won a prize or ate a certain food. And basically, a stranger is better at predicting how happy you're going to be than you're going to be. That's the takeaway. And the reason is because a stranger, I suppose, is able to, these biases don't affect them to the same extent when we think about somebody else. But when we think about ourselves, we can't help but put ourselves into that future self. But when we think of somebody else, we're, I guess, a bit more detached and logical. And so really, if you wanted to maximize our happiness for a lot of things, you're actually better off just asking somebody else to either make the decision for you or asking them what makes them happy. And the first time I kind of really learned about this was when I read Dan Gilbert's book, Stumbling on Happiness, which is a really fantastic book. I'd really recommend it. And I read a lot of books, and I do forget a lot of them, but sometimes there's something that really sticks out to me. And in his book, what really stuck out to me is he gave this advice about finding a career. And at the time I read that book initially, I was feeling kind of lost and really, debating different options. And he said, we're bad at predicting what career will make us happy, given all these reasons that we thought about in the past. You're not going to think about the day-to-day grind of like looking through documents. You're going to think about like, the big pay raise or something that isn't representative of the entire experience. So what you should do is you should find somebody who's doing that career and just ask them like, how happy are you right now? Because like the, say, ice bucket challenge, somebody can rate how happy they are in that moment, right? And that would be a better rating. And I thought that was really fascinating. And I've taken that advice to heart whenever I've gone on an information interview where you speak to somebody who is in a profession you're intrigued about. I ask them, how happy are you like on a day-to-day? And I find that's a really good piece of information to get. And the last thing I just kind of want to end this podcast and this episode on is, despite this fact that other people are better at predicting what will make us happy than we are at predicting what will make ourselves happy, this is really hard advice to take. Like, I know this, I've known this for years, but I still think I'm like the expert of myself. I still trust my opinion more than I trust anyone's. And I'm not alone in this. Dan Gilbert, he talks a lot about this in his book, Stumbling on Happiness. And this is another bias. I guess we're just talking about all the biases this episode, but this bias is basically the bias that we all think we're special when we're less special. And not just that we think we're better, but we think we're different. So you might have heard of this study before, but they've done studies where they ask people like, do you think you're above average on X? And then X is, intelligence or attractiveness or whatever. And people are really off the mark on this. For example, one of the studies they did, they asked teachers, do you think your teaching ability is above average? And so if everybody was answering honestly, like they were assessing, they actually had a good idea of where their performance lied, 50% would say it was above average, right? Or 49%, whatever, or 51%. But how many people, do you guess how many teachers thought they were above average? 94%. So that it doesn't make sense statistically. So people are, they really just don't have an accurate perception, those teachers. And it's not just teachers. Another study, they asked drivers if they thought they were safer than the average driver. 90% thought they were safer. So another absurd result. So some of these results I've read in the past, some people interpret this as, oh, we all think we're better than we are, like people are narcissistic, and that's a whole other conversation. But what's actually interesting is it's not so much that we think we're better, but it's that we think we are different. Because they also asked this kind of question in a different way where they said, do you think you're selfish or selfless? And people were both more likely to say they were selfless, more than 50% of people said, oh, I'm more selfless than the average person, but also more than 50% said they're I'm more selfish. So even when you phrased it in the negative, people were more likely to identify with that than what we would expect. So the main finding is that we just see ourselves as unique. And this makes sense because all we know is ourselves. We're in our own minds all the time. We don't know what other people's experiences are like. And without getting too Buddhist on everybody here, the self is something we construct in our mind. It's it's not objectively real, but it feels really real. And that's, one of the reasons why humans have accomplished so much is we have this really strong sense of identity. And that means we think we're so different than other people. But in reality, we think we're very different than other people, but we're not that different. And on one hand, that you could see that as kind of disheartening, but I see it as a positive. It makes decisions easier. I think one reason why in the West people are less people. I don't know if they're exactly, depression has gone up, that's for sure, and loneliness has gone up. So I don't know if I'd go so far as saying people are less happy, but a lot of markers of wellness have gone down. And why is that? I think a lot of that is because of our, individualism. And, it's tough because we think we have to, figure everything out, figure out our life's purpose. But I try and remind myself of this all the time. It's really not that hard because other people have been doing this for centuries. Sometimes I'll sit around and I'll really think about something for a good few years, and I come to a conclusion okay, kindness is super important, and everyone's obviously. I'm but I had to figure it out myself. I had to go through that process myself. Even though ancient, look back at, Marcus Aurelius, he already had that Stoicism stuff down. And so instead of, figuring everything out for yourself from ground zero, we can take a shortcut by actually just looking at what other people are doing and looking at what makes them happy. Because, people sit around thinking about what's the secret to a good life, and I admit I'm one of those people, but people have already thought about this question a lot, and so we can listen to what they said, because really their experiences aren't going to be that different than ours. Almost all people, we're not all the same, but most people want the same things. They want strong relationships, they want their health, they want interesting work, whether that's a hobby or volunteering or a paid work. They want to feel important. They want to feel like they belong. Most people want to feel like they're contributing to something bigger. There's really no secret. I mean, it's quite similar for most of us. So that's kind of all I want to talk about today about happiness and predicting what will make us happy. The TLDR of this whole thing is that we are bad at predicting what will make us happy. And the best way for us to make our predictions a bit more accurate is to just ask somebody who's doing whatever it is we're considering doing, and just ask them if they're happy. Because believe it or not, their experience isn't going to differ that much from ours. Unless you're a super, super strange person, you're super weird and you just you're a recluse, or I don't know, I can't even really think of anything really weird right now. You identify as being a cockroach. I don't know. If you're really weird, then you can just throw out this, knowledge I'm saying, then trust your own experience. But if you're like most people, you're going to think you're different, but you're actually not. And I fall in that camp, and I, every day, remind myself other people have figured it out before me, so I should just take their advice. And so this is me telling you to take my advice, or you can go on your own happiness literature dive and come hit me up in 3 years when you're oh, that was right. Just kidding. Anyways, great chatting to everybody, and I hope everybody's having a great day, and thank you for tuning in. I appreciate it.